Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming along to our Real seminar series. This is a health policy seminar series that's jointly organised between the Real Supply Research Unit, which is run out of the Centre for Health Economics at the University of York, and the Real Demand Unit, which is run out of the University of Oxford. And the aim of this seminar series is to bring together people working in research, in health economics, to hear from people with experience in policy. We can learn from them about what's most useful in terms of research, how to make our research useful and impactful within the UK NHS. So for today's seminar, we're very happy to be hosting Matthew Taylor, and he's Chief Executive Officer of the NHS Confederation, and he's going to be presenting the Reform and Innovation Challenge for the NHS. So Matthew has a wealth of experience at the heart of government and public policy over the last 20 years. He joined the NHS Confed as Chief Executive in June 2021. And as that, he can be a voice for a range of NHS organisations and advocating on their behalf to the government. Before that, he led the Royal Society of Arts for 15 years. And prior to that, he was Chief Advisor on Political Strategy to the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and he also ran the Institute for Public Policy Research for 4 years. He started his career actually as a health policy researcher, having led a health policy research unit, and he's a widely known commentator on policy and politics and public health service reform. So Matthew's going to outline his thoughts on how health economics and academia can help shape policy and ensure health and care systems are equipped to meet future challenges and deliver better outcomes and reduce health inequalities. So we'll listen to Matthew's talk, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers with the room and with people attending online. And then we'll have a further extended session for people in the room. But I'd like for us all to just welcome Matthew and pass over to him to give us his thoughts.
Thank you. I also live just off the Bishey Road, so that's the real reason they asked me, because my travel expenses are really modest. It's great to be here at the Real Research Unit. I was thinking that you could have a research unit focused on NHS targets. You could call the Unreal Research Unit. But I have to say, being at York University is kind of slightly unnerving for me, because I moved back to York 2.5 years ago. But I grew up here, and my father was an academic here at the university. And I used to spend my summer holidays playing pinball with hippies in the Students' Union. Do you want to hear more recollections of my time at York University in the 60s? I'm just warming you up, you know. My father was a Trotskyite at that time. It was a brief period. He was a member of York International Socialists. And they had a Sunday football team, and he used to take me sometimes, and they were terrible. And invariably, they'd be like 4-0 down at half time. But being Trotskyites, they'd have a doctrinal argument about whether this was the right time to progress or to retreat. And they'd still lose 9-0. But my father carried on living here for many years when I had moved away, but I'd come back. And at that time, his best friend in York was a guy called Victor Lewis Smith, who died a couple of years ago. Fantastic, very funny guy. And there is a point to this story. Victor did a program on Radio York called Snooze Button. He kind of invented prank calls, actually, and it was so popular, this program, that people would drive from other parts of Yorkshire and park in laybys so that they were within the BBC York reception area, so they could listen to this anarchic program he did every Sunday morning. Anyway, Victor was forever doing terrible things, but one year for York Student Rag, I think, so there was a charitable intention to this. He got sponsored, and he was sponsored that he would get a policeman to utter a certain phrase in court. And what Victor did is he climbed up York Minster, took his clothes off, and then got arrested. And then he was taken to magistrates' court for whatever misdemeanor that is. And he hired the most expensive brief in the country. And at the point at which he was arrested, he said something, and then the magistrates' court's full of students waiting for this moment. And the brief gets the poor police officer, who's standing up there. He says, got his notes, and he says, "Would you tell us what the accused said when he was arrested?" And the poor policeman then read out what Victor had said, which was, "It's a fair cop gov, but society is to blame." At which point he got all the money, and there was pandemonium in the court. Now, the reason I tell you this story, apart from the fact that I love to recall Victor's anarchic sense of humour, is that in a way, that's partly one of my themes for today's talk, which is the NHS is in crisis, and that is a fair cop, but in many ways society is to blame for the reason that we're in that plight. That'll be one of the themes in what I'm going to say. I'm going to structure my talk around 6 questions, the answer to which I believe holds quite a lot of the kind of fate of the health service, but not just the health service, also the nation's health, and also the health of the nation. I've not got a word-for-word speech in front of me. I'll be a bit more discursive. So if I pause occasionally, it's not because I've missed my place on the page, it's because I'm working out whether the point I've made is valid or whether I should say more about it or less about it. So I hope you'll enter into the spirit of it, and feel free, if I say something that is complete nonsense, to just jump up and say, "What are you talking about?" We'll see how it goes. The other thing I should say before I get into this is that I'm going to be talking more about how than what. That is to say, I think there is broad agreement about the things that we need to do differently. I think Wes Streeting's shifts are not, which I'll refer to later, are not bad as a description of some of the fundamental things that we need to do differently in the health service. That's that journey from treatment to prevention, from hospital to community, from analog to digital. The problem with the health service is always how. How do we make change happen? Indeed, I speak to health leaders all the time. I do visits. I did a visit this morning in Bradford. I very rarely hear people disagree about where we ultimately want to get to, but I then very rarely hear a lot of optimism about the journey that we need to go on. So look, I'll just start with telling you what you all know, because it's blindingly obvious, and that is, the NHS is in a very parlous state right now. I don't know how many of you read the Darzi review or read the hundreds of pages of appendices, but you'll recognise that story. There is a significant gap between the capacity the health service has and the demand that it faces. That gap has grown up and has the characteristics that it does as a kind of combination of Darzi developed a kind of formula, didn't he? It's austerity plus botched reforms times COVID is what gets you to where we are right now. Austerity plus Lansley reforms times COVID, and that's where we are. In terms of funding, we're kind of not a million miles away from the average of countries like us in revenue terms, but we're a lot behind in capital investment. And it's that big capital gap, which is a particular problem, which means there's I think, £14 billion maintenance backlog in the NHS, crumbling buildings, outdated equipment, etc. And then how does that manifest? Again, as Darzi told us, it manifests itself in long waits and problems with access. It manifests itself in mediocre outcomes in comparison to other countries, and in declining public confidence. The public has never been less confident in the NHS than it is right now. It also manifests itself in staff harms, in just how tough it is to work in the health service, and the kind of moral injury. The moral injury that is being experienced as we speak in emergency departments all around the country as people provide a level of care that they didn't come into the health service to provide. More profoundly, I would say that the NHS, this is a crude distinction, I know. I think Stephen Fry once said the world is divided up into 2 kinds of people, the kinds of people who divide the world up into 2 kinds of people and the kinds of people who don't. So I'm aware that of these kind of false dichotomies, but there is a kind of crude dichotomy between episodic care when you need a mole to be checked, or antibiotics, or a kind of health check or whatever, and care for people who have complex, long-term, multiple conditions. And we kind of fail on both sides. So on the episodic side, what people want is a retail offer. They just want things to be, quick as possible, on time, convenient, get it all done. And that doesn't really happen. But I think we're getting better at bits of it, actually. And, the app is getting better all the time. And Pharmacy First is great. There are things that we're doing better all the time. We underestimate, I think, sometimes the progress we have made. And actually, people's pessimism about the health service is so profound now that when people talk about health service, they tend to go, I used the health service. It was actually all right. I think people have got into the state now where they think that if they go, anything is going to be catastrophic. And actually, most people's experience of care is pretty good. But the episodic side is clunky and inconvenient and slow, and the access problems. And then on the other side, I would say more profoundly, actually, people who have long-term, complex, multiple conditions find themselves bouncing in and out of a system that is really very bad at understanding them as whole individuals, dealing with them whole individuals, and empowering them as whole individuals. So that's kind of, where we are. Underlying even that is demand and expectations. So demand partly from population aging, although I was chatting to folk beforehand. Actually, I read a brilliant piece in the Financial Times yesterday by Sarah O'Connor that I really advocate, which says we think about population aging wrongly. We shouldn't think about, the issue is not how long people, how old people are. That's not the issue, because age doesn't tell you a great deal about people's health. The issue is how many people are within 15 years of their life expectancy. When you look at that, it's not such a big change. So population aging is part of the issue, but actually it's really the state of people's health. The real problem we've got is that we live longer, but we do not live longer in a healthy state. So we are sicker for longer. That's what drives demand. But also the other side of this, which we don't talk about enough, all of you know about this if you work in health, but we don't, actually, it's interesting, it's often missing from the public discourse, is that our expectations are rising all the time as well. The cancer survival rate has doubled over the last 50 years, which is a great thing, but it means a lot more people having quite expensive treatment for a lot more time, and that's a wonderful thing. But expectations, I'm old enough to remember when a cancer diagnosis was kind of, go home and put your affairs in order. And then also we are meeting a whole range of needs that we didn't really even know about before. The number of people treated for ADHD, for example, has risen dramatically, but apparently we're only still diagnosed 20% of those people who have that condition who could benefit from intervention. So what you've got demand and rising expectations, and that's why health economists, and I hesitate before saying anything about health economists because that's what many of you are, but that's why health economists, I think, on average, say that systems like ours would need to grow by about 3.5% a year to be able to kind of improve, to sustain and improve outcomes. And I think over the last 15 or more years, I think growth has been around 2% a year. So, it has opened up a gap. And as I say, capital has been even worse. So that's kind of where we are. I'm summarizing that Darzi review. Where are we in kind of policy terms? Well, we know we have a government that is committed to rebuilding and reforming the NHS. The NHS is very dear to the heart of the Labour Party. People in the Labour Party tend to think the NHS is their greatest achievement, so they have a particular kind of commitment to it. The public trusts Labour much more with the NHS, so it is a core priority for the government, one of their big mission areas. We are hearing regular announcements. We have a very ambitious target on waiting lists. And of course, we are expecting a 10-year, there will be a 10-year plan published in May or June, which is supposed to set out the big strategic direction for the health service. That plan will have at its centre the 3 shifts that I described earlier, West Streeting's 3 big shifts. I'll repeat them, from treatment to prevention, from hospital to closer to home to community, and from analog to digital. As I said before, a lot of agreement about those kind of shifts. But the reality is we have failed at this for a long time now. So Wes Streeting is not the first person to say that we should invest more in prevention, and he's not the first person to say that we should provide more care closer to home and in the community. He's not the first person to say we should be investing more in primary than in acute. We've been talking about this for decades and we haven't done it. In fact, not only have we done it, we've gone in the opposite direction. So we have a lot more doctors in hospitals and fewer full-time GPs. This time, we have to do it with no money. So when I worked in government for Tony Blair, we did it great stuff, but I think the real expenditure on the NHS was going by 6 or 7% a year at the core of that time. That's never going to happen. I don't think so, not going to happen in my lifetime, unless something very dramatic changes. So we have to do what we failed to do before, and we have to do it with no money. I think anyone would say that the chances of success are slim. I said my father was a Marxist. He was here. He would quote, this is the time to quote Gramsci. One of Gramsci's famous Italian Marxists, one of his famous quotes is that to his followers, as Mussolini marched through Italy, was that we needed to demonstrate pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And I think, in a sense, that's what we have to do. Intellectually, there are lots and lots and lots of ways that things could go wrong, and there are a very small avenue for things to go right. But in the end, we have no choice but to try to pursue that angle, to try to make it right. So when I talk about the things that I think we need to do to get this right, I don't want to underestimate how difficult it is. And I don't want you to simply say to me, well, it's failed before, because I know what the odds were up against, but we have no choice but to try to get this right this time. So let me move on to these 6 questions, and I've tried to do this in a way where each question leads on to the next question. I hope it's not too trite, but what I didn't do was start every question with the same letter. That. I don't do that ever since many years ago. I was a football coach. When I say I was a football coach, I mean Sunday morning kids. And we were playing, and our team was winning 4-0. It was pouring with rain. It was really muddy. And the other coach was trying to inspire his team of demoralised 9-year-olds who were losing 4-0. And he said to them, lads, he said, it's about the 3 T's. And one of the kids said, what's the 3 T's, coach? He said, well, it's the attack, the midfield, and the defence. So anyway, I'm not going to do that, but each of my questions hopefully does flow one to the other. So I think the first question is this: can we, and can the government, and can the public focus genuinely on the health of the nation rather than just the health service? So can health policy be about the health of the nation and not just the health service? I'm quite aware, by the way, that a lot of what I'm going to say is blindly obvious to people who work in these areas, but sometimes it's useful to kind of remind people of the core arguments. So as I said earlier, the greatest challenge we have as a nation is not actually the state of our health service; it's the stalling of improvements in healthy life expectancy, and that is what generates the curve of doom. That the Health Foundation and others have pointed out, but the OBR has pointed it out over and again. We made it clear that if we can't improve healthy life expectancy, not only is it very hard to see how the health service sustains, but it's very hard to see how the public sector survives, and it's very hard to see how the economy survives, and it's very hard to see how the country kind of survives. And that might sound like an exaggeration, but it's not, because if we don't do something about that demand, that flow of demand resulting from a poor healthy life expectancy, I'm not going to do lots of statistics, but we're talking about the number of people living with major illness is projected to increase by 2.5 million over the next 15 years. So that means the proportion of people in the population living with major illness will go from 1 in 6 to 1 in 5. But actually, the proportion of people aged less than 70 with major illness is also increased substantially from 2.4 to 3 million. So these curves mean that the NHS is unsustainable. But of course, what they also mean is that if you don't do anything about that, the money you've got to pour into the NHS takes away from the money that you could pour into other public services, which are arguably as important, more important maybe to our future prosperity. So the budget of the Department of Health has risen from 26% of all public expenditure in 98 to 43% now. So less money for education, less money for defence, less money for all sorts of other really important things. So if we fail on health, the public sector will continue to deteriorate. And this is a very real thing. If you sit in local government, we work with the health service as closely as we can with local government, but people in local government listening to the health service back, going on about having no money, and they kind of go, well, you should try being in local government because you've had more money every year. And yes, it hasn't kept up with demand, but we've not had any extra money and we've had to just stop doing things. Whereas the health service, it doesn't really, generally speaking, ever stop doing things. So this issue is of material significance to the health service, to the public sector, to the economy as a whole, because then if health goes on eating more and more of the public sector, then we'll have to raise more money for the public sector, which means higher taxation, which means all things being equal, a less competitive economy. So that's the first question. Can we continue to focus on the question here being the health of the nation, improving the health of the nation? And that is the number one question upon which everything else depends. Or are we going to retreat into saying, no, the problem of health is just a problem of how we manage the NHS? And that does really matter. It's not just a conceptual point. It's really important argument with the Treasury. Does the Treasury accept what the OBR says, that not that failure to improve healthy life expectancy is going to be catastrophic for public spending? And that's really important if you're going to persuade the Treasury to invest in things that might improve health further down the line. So that's the first question. The first question we need a positive answer to is, when we think about health and we think about the crisis of the NHS, we think about that through the lens of how do we improve the health of the nation. The second question that I think we have to answer, which flows from that, is, can government work differently across Whitehall? So I guess we all know that healthcare, and the estimates vary a bit, but healthcare is responsible for about 20% of our health outcomes, genetics about 30%, and social factors about 50%. So if we are going to think about improving the health of the nation, we have to look at it through a very different lens when it comes to how Whitehall works. We have to understand that health needs to be the business of every part of government, not just the business of Wes Streeting and his team. Now, this is the insight that lies behind the idea of, one of the insights that lies behind the idea of mission-driven government. And we as an organisation of the NHS Confed are really excited about, really committed to that idea of mission-driven government, that it's about a set of missions that flow across the whole of government, strategic priorities for the whole of government. So where are we on that? We elected a government last summer. This was one of its big ideas. Well, I'd say that to say the jury is out is probably charitable, actually, in relation to this. There has been some things that are good. We've done a lot of work at the Confed around the relationship between health and work, because one of the other massive economic challenges to this country is the millions of people who are out of work for health and care related issues. A figure which rose in this country before COVID and has carried on rising since COVID, whereas in other countries it's now gone back to the pre-COVID level. In this country, it's continuing to rise. So more and more people, and that's generally people of most of your age who've got musculoskeletal issues most likely, or maybe cardiovascular issues, and then young people, it's primarily around mental health. So the government has done some work on that, but it's pretty small. It's not anything like the scale it needs to be. So I talked to Liz Kendall the other day. There is some work between DWP and the Department of Health that has been for some time, actually. So that's good, but it's still nothing like the scale it needs to be. Also, the NHS, of course, is a major employer. So another dimension of that work and health thing is the role the NHS itself can play in terms of skills and career pathways. But there are lots of other areas which are as yet untouched, where we need much more synergy across government. I'll give you, a couple of examples. Housing and homelessness. I spoke to a GP a year ago in Manchester. She said a third of her patients, the real issue they've got is a housing issue. They present with a health issue, but the issue that really underlies that is a housing issue to do with damp, inadequate housing, worry about debt or whatever. So, or then, street homelessness. I was in a mental hospital a few days ago. They've got mainly acute wards, and homeless people are simply released back onto the streets. Well, what's going to happen to somebody who's been in an acute mental health ward for 6 weeks and who's then released back into the streets? Well, they're going to be going round and round that system. So, and if you go to an emergency department, you'll find that several of the people in that emergency department are homeless. But what are we doing to join up policy around that? I give another example. Last week, I was looking at a brilliant mental health intervention in schools, a really good whole school mental health intervention funded by the Mental Health Trust, but it was a curriculum intervention. So, and I talked to the people who are doing this work, and I said, do you know about this debate in education, that debate in education, this in education? No, we're health people. So we've got a special educational needs system in collapse. We've got a CAM service in crisis, but actually still in many places, we don't have a joined up conversation about children's well-being and what we need to do in schools. So, we're not going nearly as far as we need to go in thinking in Whitehall in a way that joins up around people and around their needs. So what do we need to do for mission-driven government? So first of all, we need clear national priorities which drive policy across Whitehall. And I'm concerned that although Labour's got a really ambitious commitment in its manifesto about reducing healthy life expectancy, you don't hear much about that. You hear a great deal about the waiting list pledge, and waiting lists matter, don't get me wrong. And waiting lists contribute to our healthy life expectancy problem, but they're a relatively small contributor to it. So we need really clear national priorities that people across Whitehall accept responsibility for, in a way that we've kind of got used to when it comes to environmental sustainability. People don't go, well, I don't have to worry about environmental sustainability. That's just the responsibility of a particular part of government. Everyone kind of gets it, and we need to have a similar approach to health. Secondly, we need, to a mission-driven government to work, we need new forms of accountability and measurement. I talked earlier about the Treasury. We need to recognise that prevention spending in one bit of government will benefit another bit of government in 5 years' time, but actually the way in which we do national accounting really is, not very good at enabling that kind of thinking to take place. And then thirdly, we just need government to be much more agile, so that when problems come up which sit in these kind of department spanning areas, problems like homelessness or children's mental health, we're able to kind of get teams of ministers and officials together and actually solve problems that at the moment feel intractable. So that was my second question, was can government work differently across Whitehall? And as I say, at the moment, I think the signals are mixed, and we need to encourage government not to lose sight of the need for a completely different way of approaching health policy, which the departments and silos of Whitehall are absolutely not used to. So then my third question, and this might sound quite kind of abstract, it'll certainly sound boring, but I'll share it with you anyway. Can the NHS better balance horizontal and vertical? I was trained as a sociologist, but I use really over-complex language all the time. There's an old joke, which is, what do you get when you cross a sociologist and a member of the mafia? And the answer is someone who makes you an offer you can't understand. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the centralisation of the NHS and the politicisation of the NHS is a really big problem. And Aaron Bevan famously made the promise that the sound of a dropped bedpan in Tredegar would reverberate around the Palace of Westminster. And sadly, it's kind of still true that problems in the health service rapidly become politicized, rapidly subject to the assumption that they need to be resolved through some new central intervention. So we have a proliferation of targets, we have a proliferation of regulation, we have a proliferation of routes of kind of accountability. And the consequence of that is one of the consequences of that is a short-termism, which has been a huge problem for the NHS. Now, let's give credit to Wes Streeting. He's the first Secretary of State to come in to office for a generation who hasn't ripped up the structure of the health service as a kind of, virility symbol. I mean, Andrew Lansley did that. If you go way back to 97, Frank Dobson did that. They took things which could have been adapted to work, like GP fund holding in Frank Dobson's case, or the kind of the Labour's inheritance in Lansley's case, and they could have done small incremental things, and instead they ripped everything up, and it was a huge kind of problem in terms of morale, in terms of cost. So short-termism is part of the problem. But there's a kind of deeper issue around the kind of level of central control of the health service. And it links into the things that I've been saying before. That actually, when you look at health, that the NHS and health more broadly, it is part of a very complex system. There's all sorts of things. If any of you who worked in or with the health service, one of the things that really hits you is just the sheer complexity of it. And the problem is that the more complex the system is, the harder it is to effectively manage it from the centre. This isn't to say the centre isn't important. It isn't to say we shouldn't have public accountability. It isn't to say we shouldn't have some targets. But it's the proliferation of it that is the problem. And I'll just, if I might, make a little detour here, because my background is in policy making in general rather than in health. And I did a lot of work at the RSA and other places about why policy fails. So most policy fails. It doesn't achieve what it was intended to achieve. That's policy that's about, particularly policy that's about human beings doing things differently. It generally fails. And if people are thinking, well, that's government for you, 2/3 of corporate strategies also fail. So why is it these kind of big attempts to get people to do things differently fail? Well, I did a lot of work on this, and it turns out that there are two non-trivial reasons why policy fails so consistently and why strategy fails so consistently. The first is that what we try to do is intervene in complex dynamic systems. We try to influence individual or small numbers of variables in complex dynamic systems. And when we do, the consequences are not what we thought they were going to be. That effect is dissipated, or else you get a counter effect. So we try to change small variables in dynamic systems in ways and systems are unpredictable, and we don't get the effects that we're going to get. That happens over and over and over and over again. It's non-trivial, it's inherent. And the other problem is kind of path dependency, which is that in any organisation, in university, anywhere else, you want to do a big strategy. It takes ages to get permission to do it. You finally get permission to do it. You do it in the real world. Things go wrong. What do? You kind of double down. My former colleague Jeff Mulgan used to refer to this as the journey from evidence-based policy making to policy-based evidence making. So you go from the policy based on the evidence to finding the evidence to justify the policy. There's also another form, interestingly, in government of path dependency. It's the reverse form, which is you do something, it doesn't work, you start to adjust it, it does start to work, but it's got a bad name for itself, so then it's abandoned. So it's quite interesting. You look back at some of the things that Labour did in the administration I was part of. The initial evaluations were not great, but subsequent evaluations were much better. New Deal for Communities, Troubled Families Initiative, Sure Start, all evaluations got better as time went on, but all got abandoned, partly because the first evaluations weren't positive. So the point I'm making here is that if you're trying to change a complex system, you will always have these problems of how do you intervene in complex dynamic systems, and how do you avoid this kind of path dependency that leads to you continuing to put resources behind things that don't work or pull away from them at the point they are. So the phrase I came up with in the RSA to describe what you needed to do was this. I said, what you need to do is you need to think like a system and act like an entrepreneur. So you need to try to understand things systemically. So when we look at the health service, we need to try to understand how it all works, all the different parts of it. How do they connect, the way that patients flow, the way that money flows, and how the NHS works with all the agencies around it. But then, once you've decided what you want to do, you need to be really agile. You need to be really adaptive, because you can't be sure what's going to work. And when something does work, you need to do more of it quickly. And when it doesn't work, you need to reimagine it and think about how you can do it differently. The fact is, if you wanted to create something as unable to think like a system and act like an entrepreneur as possible, you would probably create Whitehall. It is designed not to think systemically and designed not to act entrepreneurially. And so the problem with a centralised system is that it does things it's just not able to do. And that's why we have to devolve more to system level, ICSs, to place level, York, towns, and particularly to neighbourhood level, where it is possible to see the system as a whole. And it is possible, because you can literally have people in the room together, to be agile and to be adaptive as you go about things. So I find myself spending quite a lot of time talking to ministers and officials. And one of the things I say to them is, look, all the narrative you hear is about what you are demanding from the system. And actually, we need to have more conversation about what does the system need from the centre. So we need a centre that is better at solving some of the problems that beset us, like how difficult it is to get capital investment approval, like perverse financial incentives, like over-regulation. We need the centre to solve those problems, which it's not solving, and at the same time we need them to not try to solve problems that they're really not suited to solving, and instead to let leaders lead. And some of this is kind of, I want to bring this alive a bit more kind of vividly. It's kind of slightly tragic the way this happens, this kind of process happens. I'll give you an example I came across in the last few days. So, a couple of years ago, in a winter that was actually even worse than this winter, although we thought it was a one-off, we thought it was the big post-COVID winter, so, it's not a great thing that this year winter's marginally better than 2 years ago. But one of the things that happened 2 years ago, when we were in the middle of the winter, as we built up to the winter crisis, was there was a kind of acceptance based upon research that the biggest risk to patients in winter was delayed ambulance response times. Right? So there's all sorts of risks in winter, but there was a kind of agreement that the biggest risk was ambulances not getting out to people who'd collapsed with a stroke or a heart attack or whatever it was, and they were lying in their kind of front room. And so what this led to was a kind of legitimation of corridor care, and an acceptance by hospital leaders that they would take more people in, and it was, corridor care is far from perfect, but it was better than those ambulances waiting a long time to go out. Now that's absolutely right, and that principle was accepted. That's good. Leave it at that. The problem is, that then gets turned into a target, and the target is ambulance response times. And then what happens, and this happens again and again and again, I spoke to a hospital leader last week. He's got 150 extra medical patients in his hospital now. So some of them are in the corridors of the ED. Some of them are packed into wards, so that a 5-bay ward has got 6 patients in it. And some of them are in surgical beds, so they're having to cut back on their active waiting list. So what's happened is this. We've now got a new equilibrium. It is no longer the case that the biggest risk is ambulance response times, because the level of risk now in the hospital is equivalent to that. Now this leader, is talking to his ambulance service about what do we do with this? This is a new situation, how do we respond to this? But he's only being held to account on ambulance response times, and he's got people ringing him every 2 hours going, deal with your ambulance response time. And he's a grown-up person, he's paid a big salary, he's been around for years, he knows how you've got to try. It's a difficult thing to deal with, but he ends up in a situation where a really important principle that we should have operated on, and it was fine to look at and to measure, turns into a central target which ultimately starts to become counterproductive. And I'm not criticising anybody for this. This is a kind of inevitable process, but you see it again and again and again and again, and there's a kind of So that's why what we need to try to do in the health service is to have less central vertical control, but instead, because accountability really matters, strengthen accountability, horizontal accountability. So that's accountability the health service has to local government, to the voluntary sector, and to communities. So we need the NHS to be more accountable at that level, but at the moment there's not the headspace to do it, because most people in the health service spend a lot of their time looking upwards. So that's the next thing, that's the next question. Can the NHS be better at getting the right balance of central control and local autonomy? Okay, so then my fourth question, and I won't kind of go on at length about this, but it is important, is can we reconcile the short and the long term? So the NHS is perpetually in crisis. You know, it's in a crisis at the moment. We read about it every day, but you know, those of you of my age, we can recount, can't we, the different crises that have provoked, you know, what was it that led to Tony Blair, you know, having the most expensive breakfast in history when he promised that the NHS would match the European average? It was because there was a crisis. You know, what was it that led Margaret Thatcher to the Kenneth Clark reforms? Because there was a crisis in Birmingham children. So crisis after crisis after, there will always be crises in the health service. So we have to accept that. And it's no good saying to politicians, well, you need to kind of, you know, go on the Today programme and go, oh, it's not my business, you know, I don't care. I mean, that's not going to happen. But what you do need to do is if we've got a reasonably shared account of where we want to end up with, if we do want, you know, what Wes Creasy has said, if we do want to be better at prevention, if we do want to have better models of care, if we do want more care in the community, we want to invest more in primary, etc., etc., if we want to do those things, we've got to find a way of dealing with the short-term crisis in a way that aligns with where we want to get to in the long term. So one of the concepts I use a lot when I talk to people in health policy is the concept of split-screen thinking. In this screen, you've got where you ultimately need to get to, and in this screen, you've got what's happening today. And what you've got to try to do is to solve these problems in ways that at least don't undermine where you're trying to get to in the long term. Now, that might sound like an abstract issue, but that has been the tragedy of the health service for the last 30 years. So for 30 years, we've said we want to spend more in primary and less in acute, and we've gone in the reverse direction because the day-to-day crises, you know, Malcolm X said it's the hinge that squeaks that gets the grease. And the hinge that squeaks is waiting lists and emergency departments, generally speaking. So when I looked at the elective reform plan that was published last week, it wasn't perfect, and there's big questions about money, but to give the government its due, that was not just a piece of work about how do we pour more money into acutes to do what's called tail gunning, which is just going to get rid of the longest waiters. There were some quite important ideas in that plan about how it is we try to do more care in primary, how we try to reduce unnecessary activity levels in hospitals. So, you know, as I say, not perfect, but it was good to see that the waiting list issue was being approached in a way that did line up, at least to some extent, with where we want to get to. Now, the problem with that plan is that when you look at what it asks the acute sector to do, it's very specific and very clear. When you look at what they're asking systems to do in the preventative space, it's much less clear. So our job in the Confed is to make that as vivid. But anyway, so that's the next question is, can we manage the inevitable day-to-day challenges of waiting lists, of urgent emergency care, of meeting demand in ways that line up with the notion of a sustainable health service in 10 or 15 years' time? Another kind of example of this with mental health. You know, the immediate issue is how do we meet demand? But we need to ask ourselves a longer-term question, is the ultimate destination here every single person who's got a mental health diagnosis and, you know, half the population work in mental health? That can't be. So we've got to be thinking much more deeply about, well, what's the long-term plan for mental health? It can't just be ever more supply to meet ever-growing demand. So two more questions. You'd be delighted to hear there's only two left. So the next question is, can innovation be harnessed to improve outcomes and sustainability? That's kind of linked a bit to Wes's last shift, you know, the analog to digital shift, which is shorthand for, you know, technology and innovation in general. And, we all know there is enormous scope to benefit from digital and from data and from medical equipment and biomedicine. Enormous scope for things to be different. Digital access, screening, personalised care, preventative medicine. The aforementioned Aradazi, talks a lot about the fact that the next generation will be a generation that generally knows it's ill before it has symptoms, or could be, if we use the technology and the medicine correctly. We could be in a world where, as a consequence of knowing our kind of genetic predispositions and wearables and stuff like that, that we don't have to wait till we have symptoms before we address issues that could enhance our health prospects. So, everywhere I go, I see whizzy things from kind of from kind of nanosurgery through to, different pathways, all sorts of everywhere I go, that people have got stories about how they're doing things differently, about innovation, about exciting change. But then you hear all this, and then you look at the actual system, and you say, well, hang on, all this stuff's happening, but why is it not making a difference to the fundamentals? And that's a very complicated question, and I could have spent my whole lecture talking about that. Maybe you thought I was going to, but I'd say fundamentally that innovation needs to be focused on improving outcomes, on equity, and on financial sustainability. So let me repeat that. Innovation needs to be focused on improving outcomes, on equity, and on financial sustainability. And a lot of the time, because innovation is often driven by commercial imperatives and by all sorts of other things, it's not really focused on outcomes. It's focused on activity. It's not really focused on equity, much at all, and health inequalities. I've not mentioned health inequalities, but they're a huge, huge part of the problem that we've got about population health. And they're not really focused on financial sustainability. And actually, the team here have done some really, we talked about this before, interesting research about the problematic relationship between novel medicines and most effective use of resources. So we need to think much more deeply about which innovations we need to really back that can make a difference in relation to outcomes, equity, and financial sustainability. Too often, innovation is simply, it's a bit random, and it's kind of led by the latest thing that's been discovered, rather than kind of saying, well, actually, what are the things that make the biggest difference? And health economists, I think, play a really important role in taking us back and saying, look, it's not just about the fact that it's new and exciting and it seems to do things better. How is it linked to outcomes? How is it linked to sustainability? What is its impact on equity? And I saw a kind of interesting example of this as well. Let me go through a couple of points and then give you the examples. So what are the kind of elements we need to get right? So one I've talked about already, which is when we think about innovation, we've got to get the right balance of what we do centrally and what we do locally. Again, I won't labour this one, I made it before, we're not solving some of the problems we need to solve, like information governance, which would really drive innovation. We're not solving those centrally, but at the same time, we're too prescriptive about certain bits of practice which we say everyone should adopt, and then when everyone does adopt it, it doesn't really work. We need a more robust and open partnership with industry. So, the evidence about NHS industry partnership is pretty good, but it is still the case that a lot of the time the stuff that the commercial sector is selling us actually doesn't really do what it's said to do, or it's designed in ways which don't, the problem of interoperability, for example. So we need to work with industry, but we need to be quite challenging as the customers of what the commercial sector gives us. We've got to be realistic and patient about change. So I'm doing an interview on Friday about the FDP, the data platform in the health service. Now, the FDP is controversial amongst certain people, partly because it's provided by Palantir, who are a bit of a kind of challenging organisation. But what I'll say about the FDP in this interview is that it's early days, but actually we need to persist with it. It's not got as many signed up to it as quickly as people might have thought. Its functionality isn't as great as people might have hoped. But actually we need to persist with it over time, because if ultimately it works, it becomes a platform upon which all sorts of innovation can then start to flow. So another thing we need to do in innovation is to be realistic about what we can achieve and patient about change. Less haste, more speed, as my grandmother used to say. And the other thing we need to know about innovation is that that service design is as important as tech. You know, that one of the things that besets the health service is new gizmos, new ways of doing things, new drug treatments, which look great on paper through the RCT, through a pilot, but actually, and we don't think through enough the people who've actually got to use those services. And this again happens again and again and again. I could, ask me, I'll give you examples. But I saw one this morning that I just thought was kind of, was interesting. So this brilliant service in Bradford, doing really great holistic kind of health preventative care with people with complex conditions. And I said to them, well, data must be an issue for you. And they said, yeah, the lack of people's records not talking to each other, not having their records in one space. But the patients they're dealing with, if you had their patient record on paper, it would be 3 telephone directories. So it's all very well saying, well, let's all put that in one place. But the idea that a clinician, who's a very busy clinician doing a test or whatever, is going to sit there and go through all of that data, I mean, it's fanciful. They're not. So, the NHS is awash with data, but it's actually about how do you use that data? How do clinicians use it in ways that are actually useful to them? So when we think about technology innovation, we need to start with the experiences of patients, the experiences of clinicians, to make sure that this actually makes their life easier. Honestly, I've got so many examples of this. I had another little kind of trivial one. I worked with Google DeepMind for a while, and they had a really good patient record system, and it was on people's phones. So people brought their phones in, they could download on their phones. And then they started to get patient pushback. And the reason for this was that because the nurses were looking at the information on the phone, entering it into their phone, because it was their phone, it had unicorns on the back and their football team emblem or something. So the patients thought that the nurses were on Instagram rather than actually attending to their needs. So they're trivial things that you have to think through, which can get in the way of innovation to make a difference. Another example, which is a really big one, is anti-obesity drugs, weight loss drugs. This is a remarkable breakthrough. The indications for these drugs are incredible. Don't just help you, lose weight. They seem to help you be less of a gambler, less of a shopper, all sorts of things. So you can reduce your kind of impulsive behaviour, and that's fantastic. But do we want these drugs to be the new SSRIs? Do we want 25% of the population on these drugs for year after year after year after year? Or are we going to try to use these drugs as part of a more thought-through pathway which enables people to feel a greater sense of control over their lives? Not, to be judgmental towards people, but what's our ambition? So that's another example of how, you've got this amazing thing, these drugs that have this huge effect, but we need to think hard about their human impact. And that then takes me, I hope you'll see how each of these questions flow a bit into each other, to the final question, which is, can we engage the public with difficult choices and new ways of doing things? So I think the future of the health service does require us to have a conversation, which, to be fair, West Streeting is trying to do with the public, about change which will be overwhelmingly positive, but may have some challenges associated with it, and may involve being more explicit about the responsibilities that people themselves have. So I'll give a couple of examples of that. So digital 111. So 111, which you just you do as a digital interaction rather than as a phone call. Digital 111 is more reliable than verbal 111, telephone 111, right? So it should be really that we say that digital 111 is the overwhelming default, and we should discourage people as far as possible from using, ringing up, but to use that digital service. That would save an enormous amount of money, and it would liberate people who are call handlers to be doing other things, more hear and treat or whatever. But the problem is that if you move to a digital 111, sometimes, just like any other system, it might get things wrong. And actually, as human beings, if someone who gives us advice on the phone gets it wrong, we kind of know they got it wrong, and we might be unhappy about it, but we know what happened. But if a digital system gets it wrong, we feel we're much more unhappy about it because we don't know why it went wrong, because it's kind of hidden in the algorithm. But we have to kind of say to the public, look, we face a really difficult time. This system is safer than this system, but you might have to accept that sometimes when things go wrong, we can't absolutely tell you why. Now that, I don't want to be fancy about that. I'm not an expert on digital 111, and that might not be the core issue here anyway, but that's the kind of honest conversation we need to have with the public. Another area is end of life. Where again, we need a much stronger kind of norm, as other places do in Scandinavia, for example, around people having a clear account of what they want to happen at their end of life, the kind of care they want to have, and then a greater ability for us to observe that. Still a very high proportion of people die in hospital. Nobody wants to die in hospital, but the system is not solving that problem. It's partly our fault in the NHS, but it's partly because people themselves are people and their families have not been clear enough about what they want. So in lots of areas, another area obviously is reconfiguration of services. There are lots and lots of fragile services that aren't great, and we need to reconfigure them and have them at scale, but the public is viscerally hostile to the closure of services, closure of hospitals, even when the evidence is overwhelming. So part of what we're going to have to do is to have a better conversation with the public about some of the choices that we need to make and some of the challenges that will be involved for them. I don't think we need to start charging people for using the health service, but I do think we need to recognise that the health service is a relation. It's not a thing we deliver. It's an outcome of a relationship between people and clinicians and the wider health service. So let me just conclude very, very briefly. So I think I said at the beginning that health is, is a problem for the nation. This is not what do we do about the health service, this is what we do about the nation's health. And if we don't do it, it's not just the health service that's unsustainable, but the whole country is in a in a kind of downward spiral. The flip side of that is that health is also the nation's opportunity. So the flip side of that is if we could get this right, it's not just good for the health service, but it's good for the economy, for public service, for the country as a whole. And I just want to kind of, give kind of three areas where you can see the problem, but actually it's to think about the solution. So, number one, there's a desperate lack of money in the health service. Everywhere you go in the health service, people haven't got enough money. The flip side of that is everyone in the health service knows that we could do things much, much better. That we could, if we could find a way, if we could get through these questions I've described, these how questions, everybody knows if you could. I talked to a chief executive of a hospital a few months ago. He's a kind of beast of the acute sector. He's seen as one of the most aggressive champions of the acute sector. And he said to me, if I could take 1% of my budget and give it to primary care, it would be a 5% uplift in primary care, and it would be transformative to them. But he can't do it because he hasn't got 1%. So we don't have the money, but actually we all know we could do things in a very different way, in a way that would be much, much more financially sustainable as well as better for people's outcomes. Secondly, I've described this incredible complexity, and there is huge complexity, and it can drive you mad and sometimes demoralises me when I go out and think, how on earth do I put all this together? But the flip side of that is there's enormous scope for synergy. If we could get the different bits of the health service to work more effectively together in some of the areas that I've described, there's scope to do things better is enormous. So within that complexity are all sorts of opportunities to organise things that work in much better ways. And then finally, I said, and this is the theme of the whole speech, just finish off where I started, that the problem is we're not looking at the issue in the right way. We're not looking at the problem of the NHS through the right lens. But the opportunity is that if we did start thinking differently, if we did start thinking about health as a national resource rather than about the NHS in crisis, that not only could it enable the health service to achieve better outcomes and be more sustainable, but it would also not only make our country more prosperous, but actually, given that health is the single most important determinant of people's well-being, it would actually make us happier. So the stakes are very high, the odds are very high, but if we could get this right, the opportunities are huge. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Matt for his talk there. So we have time for some questions now. I might just ask if there's any questions online first from Joe that he wants to select one from our online attendees before we move to the closed session.
Well, for the benefit of everyone in the room, we've had some technical issues on the so we have no questions from online so far. If anyone does want to ask a question on the Zoom Q&A, we can put that to Matthew, but understandably they might have missed a lot of the talk. So.
Okay, so in that sense, luckily we recorded it, hopefully. It will be available to watch later, we'll see. But if there's any questions in the room then, who would like to volunteer first? Johnny has a roving mic. Yes?
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. Thank you. Thanks for the talk. I think this is a very great introduction for the NHS and the long-term reformation of the whole system. So I remember that you have mentioned there are 3 reformation targets for the NHS system. It's from treatment to prevention, and from hospital to community, and also from the dialogue to the digital.
Analog to digital.
Analog to the digital, yeah. So I think for these 3 reformation, it will benefit the patients in the future and will benefit the health of the whole country. However, I mean, for the patients right now, it could mean that longer waiting time and also harder to see a specialist or harder to see a real person GP. So that might cause some like life loss or some health loss in the short term. So how do you think about the reformation laws and maybe the long-term benefit? And also, we have also observed a similar situation for the innovation drugs. For example, a lot of large countries, China, America, and also Australia, the public-funded healthcare system has been very reluctant to reimburse high-value innovation medicine. So I would like to know, how do NHS think about this question, think about the investment in innovation, or what's the stand for the whole system? Thank you.
Wow. So kind of challenging questions. Let me kind of, focus more on the first. I think not in the second is an interesting question, but I think it's in view of some of the research that's been done here. The problem, arguably, is not that we don't invest enough in, innovative medicine. It's that we invest too much in that in comparison to actually doing the things which are cheaper and work better, or not work better, but work for more people. But in terms of your first question, I think it goes back to my point about the short and long term. We can't do what everybody wants us to do, but it's not realistic in government not to say that you can make things better. But sometimes there's a choice. You can make things better very quickly in a way that doesn't get you anywhere nearer where you ultimately need to get to, or you can change things a bit more slowly because it's part of where you want to get to. And I think what we have to hope the government has the courage to do through the 10-year plan. The thing I want to see most of all from that 10-year plan is a really reasonably vivid account of what the health service needs to be in 10 years as a whole service, how the whole service needs to. And the reason I think that's powerful, and probably more powerful than lots of specific policy recommendations, is it's something to hold politicians to account for, to be able to say, look, if this is what we've really signed up to, if this is kind of how we want it to look, how we want I think a big part of the 10-year plan will be how it should feel to patients. So let's describe what we want it to feel like for patients in 10 years, and then hold people to account for solving short-term problems in ways that align with that. And I think that with the public, if the public know where you're trying to get to and they agree with where you're trying to get to, actually they are capable of saying, okay, all right, fine, we will go that way rather than the other way, because we can see what you're trying to do. What the public can't deal with is what feels to them to be like chaos, or to be confusion, or to be promising things which are impossible, or whatever. So that's where I think the 10-year plan could be really important in giving us that kind of clear account of where we ultimately want to get to.
Nick?
Thank you, Matthew. That's a really interesting talk. Your point about short-term and long-term, I think, is really interesting, and I think that's a really good example of trying to. I think you were talking about the elective reform plan doing more in primary care, with a view to releasing that longer-term idea. So I think that what I just wanted to ask is, do you have any insight as to whether the whether the government is likely to change the way in which the funding formulas work in terms of allowing a more longer-term view on budgeting? I think one of the big things that I've found, certainly in trying to work with the NHS, is we're constantly getting told that things have to be cost-saving within 1 year, and that's not congruent with any of what you've just said. So is there any sort of any indication that is going to be sort of relaxed in any sort of way?
So that's an important strand of the work on payment systems, incentives, and we're actually piloting some different, working with certain systems to think about how you could do it differently, because you're absolutely right. I mean, we incentivise activity, not outcomes. We incentivise activity, not prevention. And we need to think about this differently. One of the things that I find the saddest, as I will when I go around the health service, is that I over and over again see great practice that can demonstrate evidence that it's reducing demand, but because of the overall capacity demand gap, you can never see the effect of it downstream. So the rather trite way I express this is, if I had £1 for every time I was shown something that would reduce demand, I'd be a millionaire. But if I had £1 for every time someone in the hospital said, oh, we've got a bit of spare capacity because of all this demand that's been stopped, I wouldn't be able to buy a pint, even at York prices. So, or another way of thinking about this is, I go around and I see people, and I saw this morning in Bradford, scooping water out of the overflowing bath, but the problem is the taps are both running. And so scooping, it doesn't... So this issue of how payment systems and other systems work, in order to create a benign feedback loop, that's what you have to do, is you need to design things so that if you are able to reduce demand, it does free up money and capacity, and then you can invest more, and then you can get a benign spiral. That's one of the reasons the commercial sector is so dynamic, is it creates these feedback loops, and things can move incredibly quickly. The NHS doesn't create those kind of feedback loops. In fact, the kind of almost like reverse feedback processes. So yeah, there is work on that, and it is absolutely something that needs to be thought through. I think also kind of impact finance methods, social impact methods. So there's to give you a positive example. Macmillan has been working with social finance, and they started this in a couple of systems now. I think about 20 ICSs are doing it, and it's in NHS terms, it's very, very small scale, but it's really interesting. So what Macmillan do is they get the system to invest in a different end-of-life pathway, which is better for patients, but also much more financially effective. And they've made enough profit out of that to be able to invest back in. So the ICS is making a profit on this new pathway which they developed with Macmillan, and that's now spreading to more and more ICSs. So I think one of the things, I'd like to see more of that kind of methodology, and I'd like to challenge industry a bit more. Industry, again, every time I meet anyone from a pharma company or a med tech company, oh, this thing's going to save all this money and all this, very rarely transpires. I'd like to see more, actually, of us saying, okay, fine, well, that's how the funding's going to work. So, we'll pay this up front, and then we'll pay you a proportion of the savings that we make over the subsequent years, and we'll share the risk with you, which we completely failed to do with PFI. So I think there's scope for innovation, actually.
Johnny, I'm going to ask you to walk over here to the lady with the red jumper.
Thank you very much for a most interesting review of the National Health Service. I'm going to make a comment with all humility. I'm nothing to do with the health service, but I was one of those people that was parachuted into the private sector, failing businesses, to try and find out why
Right.
and to put them right, which I did both in Europe and the United States. So one comment. Silo policies never work, silo-driven policies, because human nature being what it is, naturally people will endeavour to mould their career so they succeed in the silo rather than necessarily succeeding in the vision of the organisation. And so I think your comments about looking at vertical and horizontal are absolutely apposite. Just how much energy, effectiveness and genius is getting stuck in the silo rather than being used in a wider context. Forgive me, made a couple of notes here. The other thing we did is we did something that we poached with pride. We looked at people and companies around the world who were doing similar things to us, and we said, who do we really admire? And it meant having humility and saying that we weren't necessarily doing things the correct way, but it also opened up opportunity to show what could be. Now, the companies I was working in are a lot less complex than the NHS. But often people's dynamic, people's desire to see they're part of something that's getting better is universal. Mm-hmm. So my question, forgive me, it's taken me a while to get to it. My question is, of all the health services that you have seen around the world, which do you most admire? And which would you like to see the NHS emulate most strongly?
So, brilliant questions. On the first one, just another kind of insight into this question. So, I did a session with civil servants literally the day before the first COVID lockdown. And I talked about this methodology of thinking like a system, acting like an entrepreneur as a way of dealing with the problem of complexity and path dependency. And I asked them to go into groups, and I said, tell me what is it that most enhances your capacity to work like that, and what is it that most inhibits it? And what was interesting was they came up with the same answer to both questions, and it was process. So actually where you're in a committee which is hierarchical, not properly supported, no follow through, it's hopeless. But actually, if you're in a kind of egalitarian, dynamic, task-focused group, well supported, well followed up, strong mutual accountability, you can achieve anything. And I think that I see so much process that isn't really very well designed, actually. And funnily enough, when it comes to things like care coordination, something really simple, having people in the same room really makes a difference. When I look at some of the best care coordination places, this is, people working together to try to stop people ending up in hospital, generally speaking, but to make sure people get the right service. Literally having the GP and the social worker and the community mental health worker and the social prescriber and the voluntary sector in the same room, able to solve problems in real time, is incredibly, bringing the world to digital and virtual, but actually it really does make a difference. So, that's, the how you get out of the silo, a lot of that is to do with actually how you design processes. Who cares about designing processes, but it really does matter. And then your second point, I think the problem with the question is it supposes that you can pick something up from a completely different system and drop it down into our system and make it work. So there are lots of good attributes. America is a completely disastrous system in many ways, but the high-end care, if you've got money, bloody hell, it's fantastic. I've got friends in America, and my goodness, it's amazing. So if you want to talk about different models of kind of primary care, or if you talk about what they do in Wellington around a kind of more holistic system approach, I could look at bits, but actually the health service tends to suffer a bit from the kind of lift and shift way of thinking. So when I see learning happening, what tends to happen, when talking about good practice, is not, here's the way they do it somewhere, you've all got to do it like that, which is what you get. It's actually people in a room Someone says, well, we did this and it worked. And the person sitting next to them goes, that's really interesting. We did the same thing a year ago and it didn't work. I wonder why not. And then someone else says, well actually we did half. And that's where the learning really happens. It means taking principles, taking replicable elements, but actually thinking about how it fits into the context. Because the context of providing healthcare in York or Tower Hamlets or Cornwall is very, very different. And different legacies, different assets, all that kind of stuff. So we need an approach which absolutely respects and learns. But let me just finish with this other point. One of the things that is a consequence of the centralisation of the health service is that people spend a remarkably small amount of time in each other's institutions. So we represent all the chief executives. If I was king of the health service for one day, because I had to do one thing, and only one thing, I would mandate that every chief executive should spend one day a month in another organisation, and that every chief executive should every 2 months host 2 people from other organisations, visiting them, and then at the end of their visit, writing a report saying this is what I thought was great and what I thought was less good, etc. But because we spend all our time looking up and crisis managing, actually people spend very little time. And what I found out about innovation is that you have to see it to really understand it. You know, I've been to lots of great things, but it's only when you get in and you talk to the staff that you really understand it. You know, we publish at the conference, we publish loads of good practice and loads of good practice videos, and it's all fine. I don't think it makes nearly as much difference as going out and visiting something and talking to people who do it.
So I think what I'll do now, I realise there's still some questions in the room and
Sorry,
actually
my answers are so
online.
long-winded,
But I
sorry.
might just, in respect of people's time, might draw the seminar formally to a close. But all of you here, please do, you're welcome to stay. We have time for some more chat afterwards. But just while we're all here, and sorry to those of you online if there was technical difficulties with passing on the questions, but I'd just like to thank Matt very much for his talk and for giving a policy seminar series which I hope you all found very engaging. So thanks, Matt.